had always dreamed of a fairy tale love. But when her husband's charm gave way to eerie habits, disappearing housemaids, and a dark hunger he could no longer hide, trapped in a house with a predator wearing the face of the man she loved. In a land far from the tranquil villages of old, where the vast cityscapes met the horizon in every direction, there lived a young woman named Ayotunde. She had always dreamed of a life filled with romance, love, and the comforts of an ideal marriage. It was in the bustling metropolis of Lagos, where lights dazzled and the streets never slept, that she met her husband, Kofi. Kofi was everything Ayotunde had ever wanted in a partner. He was charming, well-dressed, and well-spoken. They had met at a high-end art gallery, their first encounter marked by laughter, shared glances, and a connection that felt almost fated. Kofi's demeanor was one of quiet elegance, and though he was slightly aloof, his kindness and calm presence seemed to draw Ayotunde closer. He always seemed to know the right things to say, yet his quiet nature left her with a sense of mystery that she found fascinating. They dated for 3 years before getting married. Ayotunde could not have been more thrilled, thinking that her dreams had finally come true. But there was something odd about her new husband. At first, she thought nothing of it. Kofi never ate any of the food she prepared for him. During their courtship, every time she offered him a meal, he would politely decline, offering some excuse. "I'm not hungry," he would say, or "I am trying to watch my weight." Ayotunde, believing that all men had their peculiarities, did not think much of it. But after they married and began their life together in their spacious home, she found herself growing more perplexed. It wasn't just the food that Kofi rejected. He never seemed to touch any meals when they dined with guests either. It was almost as though food had no appeal to him. "Why don't you ever eat?" Ayotunde finally asked one evening, after they had attended a dinner party at her friend's house, where the guests had noticed Kofi's reluctance to partake. "Well, my dear, it's just a small habit I've had since I was younger," Kofi replied, his voice as smooth as ever, but there was a flicker in his eyes that made Ayotunde uneasy. "It's not a big deal. I'm not really fond of eating in front of people." Though the excuse seemed flimsy, Ayotunde brushed it aside. She loved Kofi and was willing to accept his quirks, even though there was a growing sense of unease deep in her gut. But it wasn't just the food that started to bother her. It was the string of housemaids that kept disappearing. Each time they hired a new help, they would mysteriously vanish after only a few days or weeks. At first, Ayotunde thought it was simply bad luck, or perhaps that the women had left for personal reasons. But when she began to notice the repeated pattern, she grew suspicious. One day, after the most recent housemaid Mojisola left without a word, Ayotunde decided to take matters into her own hands. The next time the house was unusually quiet, Ayotunde asked Kofi if he knew where Mojisola had gone. "They need rest certain times," he prompted me. "Maybe you should spend quality time with them now until things cool down." Laughing at his remark, "You know how they get. Some women can't handle the city life," he said. But Ayotunde wasn't convinced. Her instincts told her something was terribly wrong. That night, as Kofi fell into a deep, almost unnatural sleep, Ayotunde heard a strange noise coming from the garden behind their house. It was the kind of noise that seemed out of place in a city. Low, growling, followed by a rustling sound. It was almost as though something or someone was rummaging through the bushes. Unable to shake her curiosity, Ayotunde quietly got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and crept towards the sound. She stepped lightly, making sure not to make a sound. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of night-blooming flowers, but Ayotunde could barely focus on the beauty of the night as her heart pounded with fear and anticipation. As she reached the edge of the garden, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, under the shadows of the tall palm trees, was Kofi. But this was not the man she knew. His body was contorted in a grotesque way, his skin stretched and rippling, as though something animalistic was clawing its way out from beneath. His hands had transformed into long, claw-like fingers, and his face, his once handsome face, had changed into something monstrously. His eyes were glowing with an unnatural light, and he was crouched over something. No, someone. Ayotunde's heart stopped as she realized it was the body of Mojisola, the missing maid. Kofi was hunched over her, tearing into the woman's body with an insatiable hunger, devouring her flesh as though he had not eaten in years. The sickening sound of bones cracking filled the air as he tore the woman apart. It all clicked then. Kofi was not a man at all. He was a creature of the night, a monster who wore the guise of a human. The reason he had never eaten her food, the reason he had never touched a meal, he didn't need it. His true hunger was for human flesh. The maids, the ones who had disappeared, they were nothing more than his prey, his victims. Ayotunde could barely breathe, her body frozen in shock and horror. But she knew she couldn't stand by and let Kofi continue this terror. He had fooled her into marrying him, had seduced her with charm and deceit. But she would not be his next victim. With a mixture of courage and dread, Ayotunde backed away quietly, retreating into the house. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to save herself. But as she turned to run, she felt the weight of Kofi's presence behind her. Ayo! Kofi's voice, now low and guttural, called her name from the darkness. You have seen too much. Te. Ayotunde knew then that it was either her life or his. With all the strength she could muster, she dashed through the hallway and locked herself inside a room. Her heart raced as she held her breath, listening for the sound of Kofi's footsteps. She had married a beast, a murderer, and now she had to survive him. Ayotunde's heart was thumping in her chest as she crouched in the small room, every muscle in her body tensed, her mind racing. The door was locked, but she knew that was no guarantee of safety. She could feel Kofi's presence, even though she couldn't hear him, his inhuman senses far sharper than hers. He was waiting, hunting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Ayotunde held her breath, not daring to make a sound. She could hear the faint rustle of the wind outside, but inside, there was only silence. Her thoughts swirled. How had it come to this? The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her life, was a monster, a predator. Ayotunde's mind replayed the strange moments from their marriage, each one now filled with ominous significance. The way Kofi had never eaten, the way the housemaids had disappeared one after another, the strange, almost imperceptible scent that had clung to him at times. Something not quite human, but no one else had ever noticed. She had been blind to the truth, blinded by love, by the idea of the perfect man, and now she was paying the price. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A loud crash came from downstairs, the unmistakable sound of the front door being smashed open. Ayotunde's heart skipped a beat. Kofi was coming. She turned to the window, the only possible escape route. The moonlight outside illuminated the tall fence that surrounded their property. It was too high to jump from the second floor, but if she could reach the ground, she could run, disappear into the city. There would be no time to pack, no time for anything but escape. Her pulse raced as she moved swiftly to the window, peering down. There was no sign of Kofi, but she could hear his heavy, lumbering footsteps below. She didn't have much time. With shaking hands, Ayotunde opened the window and climbed onto the windowsill, trying to steady herself. She glanced back one last time at the room, the place where she had once felt safe, where she had once dreamed of a future with Kofi. It was now a prison, and she could never return. But just as she was about to lower herself to the ground, a voice boomed from below. "Io, don't be foolish." Taking deep breaths, he moved closer to the waterfall and evaluated the situation. He pointed to a small pool in the corner of the pool. Kofi stood in the garden, his silhouette monstrous and distorted in the dim light. His body was more beastly than ever before, his face now entirely unrecognizable. His glowing eyes locked onto hers, burning with hunger and rage. "Yo, you can't escape me." Kofi's voice had changed, now deep and guttural. "You're mine. You always have been." Ayotunde's heart pounded in her chest as the reality of her situation sank in. She had no choice. She had to act, or she would become just another victim of his twisted hunger. Without thinking, she leapt from the windowsill, landing with a roll to absorb the impact. Her feet hit the ground hard, but she kept moving, running as fast as she could toward the gate. Kofi's roar echoed through the night air as he began to chase her. She could hear his steps behind her, slow at first, as though he were savoring the chase, but they were growing faster. Each breath she took was like fire in her lungs, but she didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to slow down. The gate was only a few meters away, but Ayotunde's strength was fading. She was too exhausted. Her feet ached. She could feel Kofi drawing closer, his monstrous form moving with terrifying speed. She reached for the gate, her hands trembling as she tried to undo the latch. A clawed hand gripped her shoulder, spinning her around. She gasped as Kofi's face loomed inches from hers, the stench of blood and death overwhelming her senses. "Did you think you could escape me, Io?" Kofi whispered, his breath hot and foul. "I made you believe I was the man of your dreams, didn't I? But now you know the truth." Ayotunde's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't give up. Her mind raced, searching for any way out, any way to survive. And then, in the distance, something caught her eye. A glimmer of light from the neighbor's house. Someone was awake. Someone was nearby. Desperation surged through her as she twisted in Kofi's grip, breaking free for just a moment. She ran toward the light, praying that someone, anyone, would hear her screams. But Kofi was faster. In one swift motion, he grabbed her again, his claws sinking deep into her arm. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the fear that consumed her. "You're mine, Aor," he hissed. "You always were. You never escape me." Ayotunde felt tears stinging her eyes as she fought against him, trying to pull away, but it was no use. Kofi's strength was overwhelming. Just as she thought all hope was lost, a voice broke through the chaos. A voice she didn't recognize, but it sounded firm and commanding. "Let her go, demon." From behind Kofi, a tall figure emerged, wielding a glowing staff. Ayotunde blinked, stunned. It was an old man, dressed in a robe of deep indigo, his face lined with wisdom and power. There was an aura of something ancient about him, something that felt like a force beyond nature itself. Kofi snarled, turning toward the old man. "You should not have come here," he growled, his voice dripping with malice. The old man raised his staff, and a burst of light shot forth, striking Kofi square in the chest. The impact was like thunder, and Kofi recoiled, his monstrous form flickering between human and beast, as though the light was forcing his true nature to surface. "Who are you?" Kofi demanded, struggling to regain control. The old man's voice was calm, but filled with authority. "I am the one who protects this city from creatures like you. You are a demon, cursed to roam the earth, feeding on the innocent. But your reign of terror ends tonight." Kofi let out a howl of rage, his body contorting violently, as if he were fighting against the power of the staff. "You cannot defeat me. I am eternal." But the old man did not flinch. He raised his staff higher, and the light grew brighter, surrounding Kofi like a cage. The beast howled again, but it was no use. Slowly, he began to shrink, his monstrous form diminishing until With a final cry, he collapsed into a heap on the ground, motionless. Eotunde stood frozen, her mind reeling from the scene unfolding before her. The old man turned to her, his eyes filled with compassion. "You are safe now, child," he said softly. Kofi was never truly human. He was a creature cursed to live among us, preying on those who trusted him. Eotunde could hardly process the words, but she nodded, tears streaming down her face. The old man approached her. "You have suffered much, but the nightmare is over. You are free." With those words, Eotunde felt a weight lift from her chest, as though the shadows that had haunted her were finally gone. But she knew one thing for sure. The man she had married was not the man she had thought he was, and she had learned the true meaning of darkness. As the old man helped her away from the ruins of her life with Kofi, she realized that though the night was over, her journey had only just begun. There was a world beyond the darkness, one that she would now have to face alone, but with newfound strength. And so, Eotunde walked away from the man who had betrayed her, free at last from his terrifying grip.